one of the things, well, there are two things actually that I would like you to remember for realism, okay? One, okay, the preoccupation or the basically prioritization, let's say, of the security interest. Security is the most important thing. So of the trade-off that I talked about before your Bayram break, guns versus butter, if you're a realist, okay, guns matter the most. Anything that, you know, comes after that is, you know, contributory to the overall aim of guns or security basically, but that's about it. And so you should remember always that, okay? When somebody says realism or realpolitik in international politics, okay, the first thing that comes to your mind should be the preoccupation of the security interest or preoccupation with the security interest. Everything else is secondary, okay? Economic welfare, protection of core values, the continuation of the, you know, type of a political regime that a country has, everything is secondary to security interest, which means then, and this is also one of the things I have asked in the midterm, if the state has to take certain measures, right, to guarantee its security, which might not be perceived as ethical or moral in the individual sense, if the overall aim is to the serving of the security interests, then that's fine, okay? The realist will tell you that if you make foreign policy, okay, based on moralistic concerns, in the longer run, you lose your primary interest, you harm your security vision. So you should always keep that in mind. Realists tell you security matters the most. For the overall security purpose, if you have to commit certain actions that are not particularly moralistic, that's fine, okay? That's acceptable, okay? It's acceptable. On the second level, you should also keep in mind the second very important factor in realism, which would enable you to differentiate realism from other IR theories, and it's this sharp distinction between domestic and foreign. What happens at the domestic level, okay, what the preferences of the people might be, does not, or should not, in that sense, influence foreign policy. Now, so bottom line, okay, what you have in realism is very straightforward. Okay? Realism tells you that the main actors in international politics are the states. Okay? Therefore, this is a state-centrist perspective. It also means other actors, okay? Sub-state actors, lobby groups, interest groups, political parties, the military, the bureaucracy, pressure groups, interest groups such as, let's say, TÜSİAD, okay? These are not, these are the sub-state actors, if you remember our actors. These don't have a place in shaping foreign policy. At the same time, for the realists, similar to the sub-state actors, the supranational actors, okay, specifically intergovernmental organizations, what are, you know, the United Nations, NATO, WTO, the Food Agricultural Organization, FAO, what have you, they don't have the most critical place in international politics either. So for realists, the main focus is what the states do. What is it that the states do? That's also very straightforward. States fight for their survival, okay? So you basically have a state-centrist perspective where other actors, of course, they are not inexistent, the other actors also exist, but they play a very limited role, according to realism, in shaping international politics, well, in shaping foreign policy behavior. But these states or countries have conflicts of interest, okay? So what happens in the campaigns and foreign policy always, and this is also a good illustration of the challenge or critique of realism, Okay? When you look at other theories that come after realism, this is precisely what they have asked. Okay? The question that you're asking, that is, what kind of a government that is in place will have a different impact on the foreign policy vision. So this distinction between domestic and foreign does not apply. So in 2 weeks' time, when we go into liberalism, you will see that that's precisely the point in the liberal paradigm, saying that the realist assumption that there is a sharp distinction between domestic and foreign does not hold true. Okay? So this is precisely what you're saying. Okay? The minute you say Obama and Romney have competing visions of American foreign policy, it means you have multiple different groups that make up of the United States that have diverging preferences over what American security interests are. Okay? Not only over the alternatives that they could use to realize these objectives, but they don't even agree on what American security interests are. Okay? So liberals then argue that this sharp distinction between domestic and foreign does not apply because different governments will have different foreign policy objectives because they will see national self-interest in a different way. Realists don't agree. Okay? So realists don't agree. Realists say no matter what kind of a government you are, no matter where your ideological premises lie, there is one national self-interest, irrespective of ideology, irrespective of political orientation. Every government sees that national self-interest in a very similar manner. So for the realists, okay, the debate that's ongoing in American foreign policy right now is superficial. Okay? But liberals don't agree. Okay? So there is a debate within the scholarly circles as to whether what I have just told you, this sharp distinction between domestic and international politics, exists at all. So Morgenthau, classical realism, 1948, this is Morgenthau's position. Okay? Kenneth Waltz, 1959, 1976, again, this is a neo-realist vision as well. But it has been contested and challenged by the paradigms that follow realism, specifically the liberal paradigm. Okay? So one of the things that you will see again in the next 2 weeks is how the liberals basically hook on to this sharp distinction. Okay? They basically take that as that starting point and use it to illustrate the points where the realists make multiple mistakes. Okay? So the minute you say there is no sharp distinction between domestic and foreign, Mearsheimer and Waltz analysis also becomes relatively less strong, because it just basically would mean if domestic shapes foreign policy behavior, then whoever is the most powerful group in whichever country, the US or Turkey, doesn't matter, whichever is the most powerful group will have its own preferences reflected as foreign policy. Okay? So these are all how you could actually see this in a very clear fashion in your minds as well. These are all how there are multiple explanations, okay, of the same foreign policy behavior. We have multiple different explanations in social sciences for the very same things. That doesn't mean that the branch in realists that focus on the American national self-interest towards Israel is wrong. Neither does it mean Mearsheimer and Waltz are wrong. It just means you have alternative visions. Okay? But in some cases, if the alternative vision is not empirically verified or is not rigorously presented, it's not worth reading into at all. So it's a matter of presenting your data, which in itself holds in a coherent fashion. Okay? So we can think differently, we can argue differently, and you don't have to buy my argument, but as long as you can put together a coherent analysis, that's fine. Okay? Fine. So 2 states. Why is conflict of interest, the minute you have 2 different players, is there? Okay? That's something critical in all IR theory. The minute you have more than 1 player, 2 states, the minute you have 2 states, conflict of interest between these 2 different players is inevitable according to realists. Okay? So this actually is important again within the realist idealist divide, the grand debate. Now, the realists argue we have a conflict, always, because they basically say every time a player, let's say player A, me, tries to promote its own national interests, it will hinder, prevent player B from doing so. Okay? So my actions as a state, I could be United States, I could be Zambia, I could be Ghana, it doesn't really matter. My actions as a state, the minute I try to promote my own national interests, okay, it will hinder, prevent other players from doing so. Okay? And this is what we call a conflict. Idealists, on the other hand, okay, start from a point that we call harmony. Okay? So they argue that that's not necessarily the case. It's possible for player A, Ghana, Zambia, US, what have you, to promote its own national self-interest, but that does not stop, prevent, hinder other players from doing so. Okay? So you have two competing visions. Okay? Conflict or discord, you can also use the word discord, on the one hand, and harmony on the other hand. Right? So harmony is a starting point. Okay? We'll have to have an underlying assumption to hold true. Okay? What would be the conditions under which a player, such as me, okay, as a state, would promote its own self-interest, and that would not prevent others from doing so? What could be the starting assumption that my actions does not prevent, hinder, stop other players from enjoying similar actions? Let me ask it like this. Okay, what am I drinking, do you think? That's tea, actually. So I'm drinking tea. The more I drink tea, I'm using water here. Okay? I gave you this example before. The more I drink my water, the less water will there be for you to consume. Why? Exactly. Scarcity of resources. Okay? We have a limited amount of resources. Water is limited. Oil is limited. Natural gas is limited. Land is limited. Okay? The more I consume land, the less Jamal will consume land. Okay? So realists tell you that precisely because there is a scarcity of resources in the world. Okay? There is only so much land. There is only so much water. Okay? Because there is a scarcity of resources in the world, okay, as one player, as one state tries to promote its own national self-interest, it will automatically mean it would hinder other states from doing so. Okay? So what is happening in Syria? It's a good illustration. Okay, it's civil war, of course. It's not an intrastate war. But what is happening in Syria? Okay? The Syrian government is able to consume certain resources, which would then hinder other Syrian actors from doing so. So there is a conflict of interest over who controls the resources in Syria. The conflict of interest is there. Okay? The minute you have two different players, okay, it could be me and Alijan. Okay? I drink tea. If I drink tea, Alijan will have less tea to drink. Okay? It could be two states, or it could be two different sub-state actors that live within this. It doesn't really matter who the players are. Conflict is always there, precisely because there is a scarcity of resources. So what should the ideals, or the idealists must be saying then? For harmony to exist, okay, what should the idealists be assuming? Exactly. Harmony pre-assumes, okay? For there to be a harmony, for harmony to be possible, you have to have the preceding assumption that there is no scarcity of resources, okay? So idealists talk about harmony as more or less a utopic position because the world is finite. Huh? The resources in the world is finite. So what the realists tell you, it's this starting element of finite resources that makes conflict inevitable, okay? But the second question, or the second component to that, is if conflict is inevitable, okay, and this is very important, does it mean that conflict will always be resolved by use of force? No. How do you resolve conflict? Exactly. There are multiple ways of resolving conflict. One possible resolution of conflict is, for example, if Alican and I, if we are two states who have a conflict of interest over a water resource, one of us could just give in. Okay? So Alican can tell me, okay, I don't want anything from the water resource, it's yours completely. That's surrender. Okay? That's a resolution of conflict. The conflict is resolved because one of the parties, surrendered completely. Or if it's me and Jamal, Jamal could say, no, I will not surrender and say yes to this, water contestation, but I will go to war with you. Okay? So in the end, I could defeat Jamal in its entirety, and he might find himself exactly in the same position as Alican has done, which is to say yes in the beginning rather than at the very end. But there are multiple different ways of resolving conflict. In the first one, there is no war. Alican gave in. In the second one, Jamal was defeated as a result of war. Okay? But both are resolution of the conflict. So it's not the inevitability of war that we are talking about in realism or in general IR theory, but it's how, due to the very nature of the world in which we live in, conflict becomes inevitable. Okay? So all IR theories, one way or another, okay, with the exception of the idealists and their harmony, find different explanations of resolving conflict, which in itself cannot be erased as long as the world is as we live in today. Okay? Limited land, limited water, limited oil, limited gas, limited money, limited everything. Okay? All resources are limited. So conflict is always there. So realists tell you that conflict is inevitable. Okay? And conflict is inevitable because of the nature of the world in which we live in. Okay? It's not something that we create as human beings. Okay? Conflict is inevitable because of the finite nature of resources. So in that sense, all states have these interests which in return basically conflict with one another. So conflict of interest is a given starting point, okay? But then realists tell you that there is a very distinct way of resolving these conflicts, okay? Which in itself is inevitable, and that's through power, okay? So all states, power becomes the tool, okay? The tool, the instrument with which states try to resolve this inevitable conflict of interest that face with other states for their own interests, for their own payoffs. So power becomes the instrument that states use to resolve the conflict of interest, which in itself is inevitable, is the basic summary, let's say, of the realist vision. So what is it about power that the realists talk about? Okay? What do states do? We already know what power is. Okay? You are now very clear in terms of power. But what states do with that power, this ability of one player to make another player to commit an action that they wouldn't otherwise do on their own, which is power, what is it that states do with that, okay, according to realism? And realists basically tell you that all states try to do the very same thing. Okay? They all have the same three basic possibilities. And it doesn't change whether you're looking at the United States or whether you're looking at Zambia. Okay? It doesn't change in terms of which the state that you're looking at. So all international politics revolve around these three main aims: to keep, demonstrate, increase power. Right? Now, to keep, demonstrate, increase power is summarized by Hans Morgenthau in his Politics Among Nations in 1948 is 3 different policies that all states use. Okay? Keep, demonstrate, increase power. Okay? And all states follow, one way or another, one of these policies in their foreign policy action at any given period of time. Okay? And then you can actually see and apply this to, let's say, Turkey or United States. Policy of status quo. Okay? It's the one that's most straightforward. Okay? Status quo is the existing balance of power or the distribution of power between 2 players at any given period of time. Okay? If, for example, you look at the status quo today, okay, in the Middle East, what do you think is the status quo in the Middle East today? Turkey versus, let's say, Iran. What kind of a power distribution do we have between Turkey and Iran? Okay? What would be the tools you would look at to see that? Okay? You would look at their military capabilities. Okay? So the Turkish army, the Iranian army. Okay? They are similar in terms of their size. Okay? They are both large countries, both Turkey and Iran. So you have population here. They're similar in how many people live in Iran? Okay, so well, give and take, very similar to Turkey. Okay, is it 100 million? Okay, fine, but they're very similar in terms of size. It's not like Jordan. Okay, so Iran is a large country. Okay, in terms of the standing size of the army. Okay, what is it that Iran has? A similar army in terms of people under arms compared to Turkey. So if you try to see this status quo, okay, Turkey and Iran has at the moment a distribution of power that is more or less stable for the past 400 years, where there are 2 large states with similar military capabilities, and they have, more or less a presence in the, in the Middle East region. Okay? So policy of status quo, from Morgenthau's perspective, would be this. Both Turkey and Iran, okay, would try to maintain this status quo, okay, vis-a-vis one another, so neither becomes more powerful than the other. As long as you have the existing balance kept intact, the likelihood of a conflict between Turkey and Iran. Okay, what are the possibilities of conflict between Turkey and Iran? Could be the Kurdish issue. Okay, it could be a border issue. We have a border with Iran. Okay, so, and the border has been drawn when? Do you remember? When is the Turkish-Iranian border set? Exactly, 1633, Kasr-i Şirin. Okay, so it has been intact for the past 400 years. But that doesn't mean the minute you are, geographically proximity, the minute you have geographical proximity, you might have a border conflict. Okay, so a possibility of a territorial conflict over border issues is still there. Kurdish issue, as Jamal says, is there. So in terms of a conflict of interests between Turkey and Iran, okay, we have potential conflicts of interest. You can bring in water, you can bring in natural gas from Iran, you can bring multiple areas over which a conflict between Turkey and Iran is possible. Now, the resolution of these conflicts, okay, do not necessarily lead to war, would not lead to war, unless, according to classical realism, there is this maintenance of the existing balance of power. So as long as both players, Turkey and Iran, would follow a policy of status quo, that is, they would keep the existing power situation as it is, okay, this is, more conducive to a peaceful resolution of a conflict. Okay, we have multiple conflicts with Iran, but if one of the players changes course, okay, how do you think that would be possible? How would one of the players change its course? Exactly. The minute one of them begins to acquire, okay, a different type of a capability under military, the minute one of them, either Turkey and Iran, the minute one of them acquire nuclear capabilities, there is an attempt by Iran specifically at an attempt to increase power. this last one, policy of imperialism. Okay? So when Iran, and this is actually critical in whatever is happening right now around you, the minute Iran develops nuclear weapons, the pre-existing balance of power between Turkey and Iran would change. Okay? Iran would acquire a new element of power from here. It would acquire a new capability. It would acquire nuclear capability. The minute Iran has nuclear capability, that's a change in Iranian foreign policy. From a policy of status quo, it goes into policy of imperialism, okay? An attempt at increasing power. So Iran, by acquiring nuclear capabilities, it's increasing its power, which is what all states do. So in response to an attempt to increase power, Turkey, United States, UK, France, doesn't have to be Turkey, would respond in a certain way to Iran, okay? But to go very slowly, what you have here is this. The minute one of the players, okay, it could be Turkey, Iran, it could be Greece, Turkey, it could be US, USSR, it could be US versus Cuba, it could be UK, France, it could be UK, Spain, it could be India, Pakistan, doesn't matter, okay? All of you have multiple dyads. Dyads, two states. You have multiple dyads in international politics. The minute, okay, the minute one of the players in these dyads acquire a new capability, which is an element of power, they would be actually using a different policy according to classical realism. Okay? So the minute Iran goes for nuclear capabilities, it's altering the existing status quo that it has vis-a-vis Turkey. It's altering the existing status quo it has vis-a-vis the US. So it's following a policy of imperialism. Okay? Another very good illustration to that, which Morgenthau also uses in his book, is Hitler. Okay? Hitler in the 1930s, what did he do? He, rearmed Germany, rebuilt the German military power, and then from 1936 to 1939, for 3 years, okay, before World War II, he acquired one after another multiple different parts in Europe. 1936, he annexed Austria. He went to the Austrians and said, Austria exists no more. It's a part of the Third Reich. It's a part of the German Empire. Then he went into Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the Czechoslovakian government was presented with a choice of surrendering to Germany. So it was, basically what Hitler was doing, according to Morgenthau, was following a policy of imperialism, that is, increasing the German power. But here lies the very important differentiation. Morgenthau says that foreign policymakers, when they look at other players' actions, sometimes misperceive and miscalculate what kind of a policy that they're following. Okay? Now, the German annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia in the 1930s was perceived by UK and France not as a policy of imperialism, but as a policy of prestige, okay? Demonstration of German power, because to bring in Austria and the Czechoslovakia did not necessarily change that much the existing balance of power between, let's say, Germany and France. Okay? So the French and the British government thought that this is not an attempt to increase power, but it's an attempt to basically demonstrate power. So they respond with, rather than policies that would stop Hitler, they respond with policies that would encourage Hitler. Okay? Similar situation we see now over Iran. So all politics, all foreign policy making, this maintaining of power is keeping power. Okay? Demonstrating power is you basically show what you actually have. Okay? So when Turkey responded to Syria last week, was it last week? When the bombs came to Akçakale 2 weeks ago, and the Turkish government responded with bombing of these targets back, that's a demonstration of power. Okay? It says it's not even a policy of status quo, it's a demonstration of power saying this is the limit and you cannot continue violating Turkish territorial landmass. Okay? So it demonstrated by using limited demonstrations of force, you demonstrate your power. If Turkey went into Syria and started an attack, it would be a policy of imperialism, change, increase the Turkish power. Now, all of this in classical realism has an important place. All players do this. They either keep their power, demonstrate their power, increase their power. It's the last one that's problematic from classical realism. If a state tries to increase its own power, okay, if it follows a policy of imperialism, it's changing the existing balance structure. Okay? So when Iran acquires nuclear weapons, okay, from a classical realist perspective, that's a policy of imperialism because it would alter the existing status quo, existing balance of power. So what to do in response? Okay? If you're faced with a country that's following a policy of imperialism, if in 1930s you are the British Prime Minister Chamberlain and you're looking at Hitler and see him marching into Europe, okay, that's a policy of imperialism. How do you react? Okay? Question. If you are, let's say, American president in 1962, okay, and you find missiles enacted in Cuba coming from the Soviet Union, okay, that would alter the military capabilities of the USSR vis-a-vis the US in 1962, because it would give the Soviet government the territorial advantage to hit American targets with nuclear weapons before the American government could respond. Okay? What to do? Is this a policy of imperialism? Would it increase to have missiles in Cuba by the Soviet Union in 1962? Would it increase the Soviet power vis-a-vis the US? Yes. Okay? So what kind of a response, okay, should we look at? Okay? And Morgenthau says that there are, in response to these three policies, status quo, prestige, and imperialism, there are two possible responses: policy of appeasement and policy of containment. Okay? Policy of appeasement is you give in. Come on. So when we had the conflict of interest over tea with Ali Can and Meltem, Ali Can appeased. Okay? He said, take whatever you need, I don't need a drop of water. Okay? So he gave in. Appeasement is you give in and you basically concede. Okay? You give a couple of concessions. So when Hitler said, I want to take Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the Czechoslovakians asked help from British and the French in 1938, and the British Prime Minister and the French Premier met with Hitler in Munich in 1938, this very famous Munich conference. The British and the French appeased Hitler. They turned to Hitler and said, you want Czechoslovakia? Be welcome to that. Have Czechoslovakia. Okay? So they did what Ali Can has done to me. They appeased, they gave in. Okay? Now Morgenthau says, okay, if you follow or if you respond to a policy of imperialism, okay, it could be Hitler taking Czechoslovakia, it could be Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, it could be Soviet Union building missiles in Cuba. Okay? They are all attempts at increasing power. If you respond to a policy of imperialism with a policy of appeasement, you end up being worse. Okay? The minute you appease your opponent, the minute you say, missiles in Cuba, so nice, I would have a better view. Okay? Or if you say, Czechoslovakia, it's a faraway little country of which we know nothing, which is precisely what Neville Chamberlain said in the British House of Lords when the British parliamentarians said, why are we doing this to Czechoslovakia? And the British PM said, it's a faraway little country of which we know nothing. The Germans want it, they can have it. Okay? So they followed the policy of appeasement, thinking it would stop Hitler. Okay? So Morgenthau says, if you appease, you end up worse. Okay? You end up finding yourself facing a stronger policy of imperialism in the next time around. So classical realists tell you that there is only one tool, okay, that all states need to do when they are facing a policy of imperialism, and that is policy of containment. Okay? You try to stop the other side. You try to contain. Okay? Containment could take multiple forms. Okay? It's not necessarily war. Okay? You don't give in containment. You try to stop the other players from taking actions that would enable them to increase their power. So United Nations Security Council meets and decides set of sanctions to be used against Iran if they don't stop building nuclear weapons. Policy of containment. The American Congress adopts sanctions on all companies that are doing business with Iran if Iranian government does not stop nuclear research. Okay? Policy of containment. Okay? The possibility of use of force is being debated in the UN against Iran. Again, policy of containment. Okay? So economic sanctions, diplomatic tools, and at the very extreme, the possibility of war are all tools that states use, according to classical realism, to contain a player, your opponent, to increase their power, to prevent them from increasing their power. If you appease them, if you don't respond to Iran, if you don't respond to Hitler, according to classical realism, okay, you will end up paying a higher price in the longer run. Okay? Because the minute you appease your opponent, they will ask for more, okay? According to classical realism. So, but then the problem is this: how to differentiate if you are building a response in classical realism when you face a policy of imperialism? How do you differentiate between, let's say, policy of prestige versus policy of imperialism? Okay? Why is it that the Turkish response to Syria 2 weeks ago is policy of prestige, the way I say it, but not policy of imperialism? Okay? Syria might easily say this is a policy of imperialism. It's an attempt to increase the Turkish power vis-a-vis the Syrians. Or the Iranians could say, well, stopping me from acquiring nuclear weapons is actually a policy of imperialism. They're trying to control the Iranian power. So this becomes then maybe an answer to Tolga's question as well. When you look at international politics, the human factor, okay, becomes important. You know, Hitler does something. Chamberlain perceives that as a policy of prestige. He miscalculates. Okay? He does not actually fully comprehend that this is an attempt at increasing power. Okay? So he does not respond with containment. Therefore, you end up with what? World War II, precisely. Okay? So, or in the case of Cuba, okay, we could be talking about a different thing. If in Cuba in 1962, the American government saw this as a policy of imperialism, which they did, but if they didn't see this as a policy of imperialism, but only a policy of status quo, because Cuba already was, you know, tied to the Soviet Union largely, then they might have ended up, or we might have ended up seeing in 1962 World War III, exactly, a nuclear war. So the ability to differentiate between what is happening in terms of your opponent's actions is critical in shaping the type of a response that you will develop. Okay? But the bottom line is, for all of this, okay, for classical realists, okay, all states operate around power considerations. Okay? Everything they do could be classified into 3 categories. Okay? Keep power, demonstrate power, increase power. There is no such thing as altruistic design. Okay? So when United States is helping Somalians in 1992 with humanitarian intervention, for a realist, okay, this is not necessarily an altruistic design. Okay? It has power implications. Okay? And if it doesn't have any power implications, you know, a genocide in Darfur, for example, nobody intervenes because it doesn't impact the power of any player. Okay? So classical realists tell you that all world politics operates around the starting point of conflict of interest and how states try to resolve these conflicts of interest in their own favor. Okay? The main tool they use is power. Okay? But power could be used differently. Okay? It doesn't have to be always, you know, an attack, use of force. Okay? That's That's not what the classical realists tell you. Okay? You could have implicit uses of power, and you could actually just stop something by demonstrating your power without actually changing the status quo. So it's the realist vision in the sense that all international politics revolve around states' interactions with one another around power concerns that becomes the dominant paradigm in international politics after World War II.